This week on What's Your Ism, our guest is Nic Dawes, or Nic as most people know him. He's the executive director of The City in New York, a newsroom that's been closely following campaigns like Zoran Mamdani's and the rise of the new American left. Before this, he was with Hindustan Times as chief editorial and content officer and also worked with Human Rights Watch, heading the media division. Way before all that, he led South Africa's Mail and Guardian, one of the region's boldest investigative papers. Nic spent decades watching how civil rights and social justice movements unfold in South Africa, in India, and now in the US.
Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
Have a tree.
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism.
All right, Nic Dawes, thank you so much for joining me on What's Your Ism. You're in New York in your office right now, at the office of The City, right?
That's right. I'm in our offices in downtown Manhattan.
From one independent outlet to another. Congratulations on all the good work you guys are doing. I checked out some of your stories. Fantastic work, Nic.
Well, thanks, Sudipto. We have both had our journeys in corporate media and found our way to a more independent place that maybe aligns more with who we are.
From the palaces to the ghettos now. Nic, there are three things I want to talk about in this interview with you. Of course, at some point, people get a sense of your ism, but I really want to understand from you the different isms that you have encountered in three different contexts, three very similar but very different contexts, which is Africa, India, and now you're in New York. And that's something, in fact, you have in common with Zoran Mamdani, which is Africa, India, and New York. Yeah. So this conversation is going to be about politics in these three places and what you have seen as a journalist in these three places. But before that, there was a formal introduction of Nic Dawes. If you'll allow me, can I make a quick, small, informal introduction about how we met?
I'll risk it.
Okay. So basically this was 2014 and the right wing was rising in India and the BJP was almost at the doorstep of power. And the newspaper I worked with back then had taken a slightly rightward shift and I was looking out because people like me were getting singled out. And then suddenly this opportunity happens at Hindustan Times. I get through the interview and everything, and this interview is happening in Delhi. And I'm asked to go and meet this one foreigner. There's this person who's helping me find my way in the office, and he's like, "Ek foreigner saab hai, unse aapko milna hai." And so I go in to this chamber, and there's Nic Dawes. He's the chief content officer, and that's not important. What's important is what I saw on his desk. There was a little statue of Ambedkar on his desk. So that is where that is my first impression of Nic. And I remember talking to him about that statue. And then we started talking about South Africa. And we talked about Gandhi, Mandela, Steve Biko. The first conversation was all about that. Nic, that's my first memory of you. Before we get into this, obviously the first thing I want to talk about is Mamdani and what happened in New York. But before that, let's talk about the other person who has this South Africa, India, US connection. A little bit about your story. Where did you discover Ambedkar? What is the story behind that statue on your table? You spoke about Biko. What were you like as a journalist in South Africa? What were your early influences? What's your ism?
Well, part of being a journalist is maybe not being sure what your ism is and finding ways to engage in democratic practice while having clear commitments, but maybe being outside some of the more comforting isms. And I cut my teeth as a journalist when South Africa was becoming a democracy. And I wanted to be part of that. Like, I really wanted to be involved in this constitutional project of building a non-racial democratic society with human rights for all. But I think, like a lot of journalists, I wasn't really a joiner. Like, I wasn't the one who wanted to be in the club. I mean, there are journalists who do, but I didn't. And so some of my friends, for example, would have now taken the opportunity to join the democratic government, or decided that, well, now we have democracy, so you can go and get rich. Probably a more sensible decision. I wanted to be part of it, but not totally on the inside of that machinery. And so I became a reporter, and I was very fortunate to have one of my first jobs covering Parliament in not the immediate period of the making of the Constitution, but the period just after that, when a lot of new laws were being made.
Which year?
There were a lot of very talented. So now we're in the early 2000s. So the Constitution was well established. Mandela had actually only served one term and retired, and Thabo Mbeki was the president.
Yeah.
Parliament was still a very active place. A lot of new laws were being made. The groundwork of the Constitution was done, but elaborating it into law and regulation, giving it meaning, was still taking place. And some of the most talented and interesting politicians in both the African National Congress and the opposition parties were in Parliament doing that work. And it was a period of like a lot of openness to the media. I had a little cabin like right just off the assembly chamber, and my job was to report on public policy, the budget, a lot of things that affected financial policy and economic development. And it was just an extraordinary perch to see the messy process of building this new society with tremendous difficulties and problems and tremendous potentiality. So that's where I started. Over time, the messiness got messier, and some of the optimism and progress of the first decade of democracy curdled a bit, particularly as corruption started to eat into the fabric of the new system more and more. And so I started doing more investigative work. And connecting flows of money and interest with public policy, not just flows of ideology or intent. And then I ultimately ended up as the editor-in-chief of a national newspaper called the Mail and Guardian, which had a long history as an anti-apartheid newspaper, and then became a campaigning newspaper really around governance, democracy, anti-corruption, human rights. But we also tried to make sure that it reflected the country and reflected the huge cultural changes, social changes, and hope that were happening at the same time as these complex problems were unfolding.
And then you did that for a little over a dozen years, and you end up in India. That transition, I mean, the first things would have been, I suppose, to you, having seen the South African experience, it must have been interesting to look at India, which has had many similar experiences. I want to get into that. You spoke about the loss of utopia, in a sense. The post-apartheid era, the 2000s is when things from Mbeki's time, the romance started waning, and then you have this period of work that you put in, where there's a lot of focus on corruption and public work and all of that. I want to talk about all of that, and I do want to see what contemporary ideologies are doing to those questions and how they are dealing with those questions. But let's start from the most immediate thing that you have dealt with, which is the political process in New York. And what I saw, you talked about a tweet. I saw a tweet about how this is the East Coast and the West Coast are the last oasis of the liberal left, the cosmopolitan liberal left or whatever. So the first question for me is it something to be excited about from the left liberal point of view, the fact that Mamdani has emerged as this face of socialism? Is that right?
I think the first thing we should do is define some terms, because the way these terms, left, liberal, socialist, are used in the US is very specific to the US. So, when we talk about liberal in the US, we tend to mean more what you would think of as a centrist any place else, or what here is called the moderate center of the Democratic Party. That's a very value-laden term, of course. Moderate sounds like a good thing, per se. But so in an American context, liberal really means that centrist, Clintonian wing of the Democratic Party. Left means significantly more progressive than that, and more interested in the role of the state in large-scale state interventions in healthcare, in industrial policy, in education, etc. And the coasts may be bastions of liberalism, but the position of that left as such is more complicated. And then finally, socialism in the US, or the movement out of which Zoran Mamdani springs, the Democratic Socialists of America, is really like European social democracy in any meaningful sense. So, access to childcare, freer or more abundant public transit, some state interventions in the economy. In his case, he's suggesting state-run grocery stores. And the big defining battle in the Democratic Party now is around what their response to ascendant populist conservatism should be. Should it be to reestablish the center? In other words, have firstly still continue to believe in democracy. That's pretty fundamental. But, have a pretty robust level of reliance on the police for procuring social order. Not going too much further than we already have with public funding for healthcare. Staying out of culture issues, particularly around sexuality and to some extent race, sexuality and gender, and to some extent race. So there's a portion of the party that wants to tack to the middle or a bit to the right because they think that's where the swing vote lives. There's another portion of the party that is very energized right now and has probably the most momentum, and that's the more democratic socialist wing of the party led by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And that's the current which Zoran Mamdani really springs from. And he's now one of that movement is now led by three people. He's now the third leader of that movement by virtue of what happened on Tuesday night. He brings with it something that is specifically New York, and that is that he springs from the diasporic communities of Queens in particular, probably the most diverse place in the world, and from the extreme pressures of cost that are associated with living in New York, and his ability to mobilize a very, very new coalition based on that mix of factors in his identity and his politics. He's also an incredibly skilled campaigner. He combines, sometimes people make a distinction between what you do in real organizing and what you do on social media. He combines social media projection and talent and organizing in quite an organic way, and almost creates, as one person I read put it, a fandom that connects organizing and cultural identification and social media effectiveness.
Right. I want to break this phenomenon down a little bit because of the range of things that have been said about Mamdani's campaign. One of them, of course, is top of mind, which is that he's very popular among people at the Cheesecake Factory. Hipsters, white, well-educated. The voting patterns that I saw. So New York Times put out this map of the voting patterns, and turns out that in the black majority neighborhoods he has not performed so well. And the thing that I assumed, I stood corrected because of that map. What I assumed based on his campaign, he was saying so much of which was on social media, I thought would naturally cater to the interests of black people, of Hispanic people, or of the working class. But the working class vote has not really consolidated behind this person. So where is the contradiction? What exactly happened?
Well, so the first thing I have to do is correct the impression that there wasn't a working class vote for him.
Okay.
You have to understand the multi-ethnic and multiracial working class of New York as being comprised of a whole lot of different subsets, and his coalition certainly attracts some of those groups. So he had a clear lead among Asian voters. Now, Asian is a very capacious term, stretching from recent Chinese immigrants to people of Bangladeshi origin to people of Indian or Pakistani origin. But in that category, he led very clearly. He performed very strongly among Hispanic voters as well, and made real inroads in that community. He lost the black vote overall, but there are some nuances to that too. So Andrew Cuomo underperformed his expectations with black voters. Part of the reason for Andrew Cuomo's strength among black voters is that he has very deep roots in black churches, with leading very traditional black politicians in New York City and even nationally. Jim Clyburn, the most important black congressional leader, endorsed him from afar, but more close to home, that is Cuomo, more close to home, people like Al Sharpton, Rodney Bichot, who is the leader of the Democratic Party in Brooklyn, those people all backed Cuomo. And so the machine politics of the neighborhoods, of the black neighborhoods, certainly coalesced behind Cuomo, who has, deep history of relationships there, patronage power, name recognition. And there are also a lot of black voters who remember, him during COVID, holding New York together, and maybe remembered that more than the sexual harassment scandal that ended his time in office. But even in those neighborhoods, so where maybe Cuomo took 60% of first choice votes and Mamdani took 30% or 20%, that was a much better performance than he was originally expected to get in those neighborhoods. For Cuomo to win, he had to extremely outperform in those neighborhoods. So when you add income to the mix, what you see is that people in the band from earning about $60,000 through to about $150,000 voted heavily for Mamdani. People at the very bottom, below $60,000, and at the top, above $150,000, $200,000, $350,000, $400,000, those people voted for Cuomo. So if you look at that map, you'll see a much more, if you look at it closely, or if you look at the city's version, which I recommend, it's more granular, you'll see very interesting neighborhood level dynamics. So the very wealthiest neighborhoods, like along the sides of Central Park, solid side, the very, very poorest neighborhoods, like in Brownsville and East New York, pretty solidly Cuomo, although maybe less than the richest. And then the broad swathe of the striving and struggling middle class, you had an amazing outperformance for Mamdani. And if you earn $65,000, $70,000 in New York, the craziness of this town is life is hard. I mean, that's a lot of money elsewhere in the US. It's of course an immense amount of money in another country context. But in New York, you're struggling on that amount, and you are really responsive to the idea of free childcare. You're possibly really responsive to the idea of lower transit costs. But you're also responsive just to the idea that you're getting screwed. And that life just gets harder and harder, and that the city is more and more being handed over to people who live in a different universe from you. And that it becomes a kind of stage set for wealthy people and tourists to take Instagram pictures of themselves. So the nature of the black vote in New York is really specific. This shares some features with with Indian big man politics that I think are maybe worth reflecting on. But his coalition is more complex and interesting than that a lot of the takes allow. And so that's my answer to that seeming contradiction.
Right. So can we then, in that sense, look at these as emergent pockets of support, in the sense that you said that this is a person who has, for generations, in a sense, these votes have consolidated over generations for the Democratic Party, which Cuomo, in a sense, has further cultivated. So there are deep roots there. But you're saying that Mamdani has managed to make some inroads there, but that those inroads are a result of the positions he's taken ideologically, I would assume. Is that a constituency, therefore, that will grow? That kind of politics within the Democratic formation, do you think that is growing in future?
Yeah, so the important piece of the analysis that I didn't introduce when I tried to break the map down in more detail was age. And Mamdani won young people absolutely overwhelmingly. And in black neighborhoods in New York, the voter population skews quite significantly older. So that's a factor too. But the other important thing to remember is we have a ranked choice voting system here. So it's not first past the post. You can rank up to 5 candidates on your ballot. So you could rank, for example, you could have chosen to rank Brad Lander first, Zoran Mamdani second, Zelnor Myrie third, Adrian Adams fourth, Michael Blake fifth. And once your first candidate is unable to succeed, your second vote counts, and then your third vote, and so on. So all the results we have now are just the first choice votes. And the fact that there were pockets of support for Mamdani in even the neighborhoods where he performed worse in this ranked choice system suggests that there is real potential. And the fact that he energized young voters and he changed the electorate by bringing out more young people than really has ever been seen. And you heard lots of stories, including in Muslim and South Asian families, of young kids persuading their parents that this is the first time they should vote, and they should vote because this is someone that they can identify with. I've heard very similar stories in Jewish families where the politics around Israel are changing, and where younger New Yorkers spoke to their parents and either convinced them or failed to convince them that this was a candidate whom they could support. So there is tremendous momentum there. There is also going to be tremendous resistance and concern and backlash. And there are already very powerful interests marshaled to oppose his campaign. Andrew Cuomo had over $25 million in donations to his political action committee, which really unleashed a pretty amazing blizzard of negative ads against Mamdani around both his positions on Israel and Palestine and on his socialism. Those folks are now looking for someone to contend with him in the general election. And their choices really are Eric Adams, the mayor, who's enormously unpopular and he was the subject of an FBI investigation and a trial until Trump ended it. And Cuomo may be staying in. So this battle for the soul of the Democratic Party is really, really playing out between what a rising, diverse, multi-ethnic, young coalition is demanding, and what more centrist forces are seeking to shore up. That's why this race and this outcome is attracting such feverish national and I think international attention.
Right. There is one thing I want you to talk about a little bit. There are two things which are visible: the candidate and the candidate's constituency, because now the numbers are out. We know which neighborhood has voted which way. Tell me a little bit about his campaign team. What is it made up of? What are the kind of people who are part of this? It looks like a bit of a movement to me. I mean, I've seen these videos of people from South Asian background saying, I'm going campaigning where I've never voted in the past. I am going campaigning door to door. What is this campaign team looking like? What is the composition?
Yeah, I mean, he has some people around him who come out of the kind of Democratic Socialists of America organizing structures. One of them actually used to work here, Andrew Epstein. But what he did very skillfully and cleverly with this campaign was to create kind of a volunteer army. 40 to 50,000 people became volunteers for his campaign and went door knocking on his behalf. Really young people who just about at voting age, people in their 20s, fanned out across the city and went to knock on doors for him. And he did some smart social media informed things to combine with that organizing strategy. Like, you could only get the merch if you volunteered for him. You couldn't buy it. He didn't give it away. So if you wanted a t-shirt that said like "Hot Girls for Zoran," you had to go and do X number of campaign sessions. If you wanted the pin or the poster, you had to do a certain amount. So he gave out like a little loyalty card that you got punches on, like at a coffee shop. And the more punches you got, the more merch you could have. And he hired very clever designers who made this very New York iconography of typefaces and photographs. And you could only tap into that really fully if you became part of this movement. So he used some of the techniques of social media and then combined them with the techniques of kind of left organizing and community mobilization into this new blend. So you don't end up with something that looks like a traditional campaign. Cuomo, on the other hand, had to pay people to go out and canvass for him, and had to use some of that significant amount of money that he brought in to pay people, which, clearly the level of motivation that you're going to get and the level of authenticity is not going to be the same. Of course, he got authenticity from some of his traditional supporters, and the Cuomo campaign was very much about, can I get, these key leaders to endorse me? Can I get some big unions behind me? Can I have TV ads behind me? So you could say it was almost like, someone said, I won't take credit for this, it was like a broadcast campaign in a Instagram era.
Right. Now, Nic, you spoke about how there was this multicultural campaign team and this enthusiasm among these diverse populations, particularly from the global south. And my question is, if you remember the last two times we met in New York, one was I think in 2017-ish, 2016-17, which was when Black Lives Matter was happening out there. Back in India, Dalit Lives Matter was happening. Rohit Vemula had happened, and so there were all these very exciting formations emerging, both in India and in the US. And thanks to social media, there was a lot of interaction between the American diaspora, the Indian diaspora. People such as Tenmuri, Soundarajan, Equality Labs, they were collaborating with Black groups, with Hispanic groups, across different types of South Asian demographics, right? Like, so you have the Ravi Dasya Sikh groups, you have, the Kashmiri groups, and you have the Tamils. And so there were all these formations that were kind of mixing, collaborating with the larger umbrella of BLM. And the same thing to an extent I saw also when I came about 2 years later. There was some residue left over from that. Now, what I want to understand is that sort of politics, is it imaginary? Was I imagining it? Does it actually exist? Or is it just a result of the 10 people that I met who were also doing all of this, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is a good and a complicated question. I think that, and if you'll forgive me for going back in time a little bit, there is a real deep history of solidarity and exchange between the politics of Black liberation in the US and global movements for oppressed people. And, that goes back a long time. And it flourished, I would say, particularly in the late 50s and 60s, when the traditional civil rights movement was at its apex, but at the same time, even someone like Malcolm X, for example, came back from his time in Africa with much more of a sense of where global movements were at and what the connection between global movements for people's rights and the civil rights movement could look like. And actually his practice evolved quite significantly. If you look at someone like Kamala Harris, setting aside her own politics, if you look at her parents, her father, Jamaican left economist, her mother, a South Asian woman who came out of a similar political tradition and who met at that time. That all of the, I'm choosing some very surface level examples, but that's a real tradition. It's not the main tradition, and I think it was very much sidelined for a long time, and it has a kind of complex relationship to the rest of the movements around equality for Black Americans. And there are real complexities in a city like New York, where actually the very long-standing Black population of the city is being pushed out by high costs. People are moving. The Black population of New York is diminishing, and the population of Asian and Hispanic New Yorkers is really growing. And there is real political contestation. There is real ethnic competition, and there are lots of opportunities to drive wedges between these communities on the basis of the idea that they're in competition, rather than forging solidarity. But I think what you see with a campaign like Mamdani's, the movement that he's part of, is an attempt to forge a more multi-ethnic working class and middle class coalition that sees common interests and that reconnects these. And at the level of younger people, that is really happening. I don't think it articulates its international roots and connections, as a theoretical precept, but I think it expresses them in its praxis in many respects. There is the strange aftermath of 2020, of the George Floyd protests, of Black Lives Matter, and now the resegregation of the country that's being attempted by the president is not sparking quite as much of a, pure sort of identity-based response as it is an attempt to build this more class alignment across ethnicities. And then the kind of politics of immigration complicate that in all kinds of ways, because you right now obviously have, ICE agents picking up people on the streets, racially profiling people, mostly people who look Hispanic. So these are really, really tricky cross currents. So to answer your question, I don't think it was just the people that you met. Those people are incredibly talented and interesting leaders who engage with that tradition, very clearly and try to activate its potential. They don't represent the mainstream of the conversation, but they're an outgrowth of some of its dynamic potential.
And like you said, it's more in the praxis and perhaps a little less theory, more praxis. And that praxis part actually makes me wonder if it is a result of the kind of city New York is. That it is, all of this is possible only in an LA or a New York is how I've heard people describe the political scenario over there, which is that for instance, when 9/11 happened, a very well-known New Yorker, Biju Matthews, who's based in New York, I met him, and he was saying that when 9/11 happened, there was this huge profiling of Muslims, and particularly of Muslims who came from West Asia. And in response, the protests were so massive that they closed down the airports. The response to the profiling, the response to all of that. And he said that kind of protest, of of course, is only possible either in LA or in New York, where you can make that sort of assertion. So this political churning, this intersection, if you like, whatever you want to call it, is it possible only in New York? Is Mamdani possible only in NY?
No, I don't think so. I mean, because the counter is that the pressures against him are very extreme here as well, because there's the organization of those who are like fearful of his policies or concerned about his policies, either on an economic basis or because of his positions around Israel and Palestine. There's tremendous power there. And there are also lots of, real everyday New Yorkers who share those worries about his views. And so the scope for pushback here is very, very big too. And America's suburbs and heartland have become increasingly diverse too. There are vast immigrant suburbs, not just on the fringes of New York, but into the heartland of the country. You'll know if you go anywhere around Brunswick, New Jersey, for example, you feel like you're in an Indian suburb with like vaguely American characteristics. And the people who are doing the work in meatpacking plants in the heart of Kansas are Central American, Mexican, and Central American immigrants. So there is definitely something special about what big cities enable in terms of density, in terms of diversity, in terms of like just the sheer character of the attention economy, which is certainly something that he rides on. And the fact that it's a Democratic Party controlled state, and the space that is keeping open at a difficult time politically and democratically. But we've seen a huge turnout for rallies by Bernie Sanders and AOC in places like Denver, Colorado. And I think one of the challenges and questions for the American left is, what is the more rural and suburban and heartland expression of their project look like, and who gets to own the discourse in those places? Is it only the far right, which is what it looks like on the map, or is it the more centrist direction of the Democratic Party, which is certainly like the more common assumption that, if the Democratic Party tacks a bit more right, it can pick up those areas? Or is it a movement to try to build the solidarity around what are increasingly difficult rural conditions, huge consolidation of ownership, the impacts of tariffs on commodity sales, soybean sales, for example, or corn sales, and then what happens to labor in those places that are totally reliant on immigrant labor, much of it undocumented. So I think we'll see, and some of that is going to be just as much as does the American center have the political imagination, does the American left have the political imagination to offer an answer that stretches beyond these dense urban centers? In Boston, you already have a mayor very much in Mamdani's mold ideologically, and even to some extent from an identity perspective, in Brianna Wu, who is really popular and very successful. That's another big northeastern city. Same in Baltimore. Chicago is more complicated, but and cities have always been the places where this kind of ferment takes root. But in India, where you have social movements that have such a deep rural base, where you have caste and class-based politics that are effective in rural areas, maybe there are some resources there for the American left to look at and think about, although they're not very good at looking outside the country.
Interesting. Okay, Nic, I think we've been, 40 minutes now into this? Okay, I want to move on to the segment about South Africa. But before that, we have three very bright journalism students who are helping with this production. So there's Shone, Satheesh, there's Prajwal, Bhat over there, who was formerly with the News Minute, and Aarav Gupta, who's here helping me in Bangalore. Do you guys have any other do you want to have a round of questions with Nic about the US elections before we move to the next segment?
So although we've not reached this part yet, it's a question on both the parts. I don't know. But as somebody who was involved in the South African civil liberty movement as well, I just wanted to ask you, how do you see the effects of the blockades that are happening in universities all across the US? Columbia is a very good example of one such university, and how that is actually impacting in real time, be that this particular election in New York, or how global politics is turning out and how people are responding to the situation in Israel and Palestine, and how that played out, let's say in 1990s, when there were similar blockades in universities all over the world against apartheid. So I just wanted to know how you see that.
Yes, it's a very important point you make, Aarav, that that there were protests and encampments in U.S. universities against apartheid, and that those are now quite romantically remembered. The universities are proud of them, and they are proud of the impact that those protests had in the broader movement of sanctions and divestment that created pressure on South Africa for change. At the time, university leadership was very uncomfortable with many of those protests and encampments, and many of them were actually cracked down on. And they were controversial and not especially popular in the mainstream. So in that sense, the protests around Israel's conduct in Gaza are not wildly different, but the political context is different. The scale of the protests is different. The global context is pretty different. But I think what I would say is that it's a hugely divisive topic. In a city like New York, it's a hugely divisive topic. There are many people who are incredibly uncomfortable with and angry about the protests. But we just had a primary election in which the candidate who is most supportive of the position of those protesters has won. Like that position would have been politically impossible in this town even 5 years ago, I would say. So if you like, the window of what is possible in US politics in relation to Israel policy has really shifted. And there's been a very, very determined fight to stop that from happening. But, the fact, firstly, that you have someone like Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar in Congress was already a shift. The fact that you can now have a mayoral candidate like Zoran Mamdani represents within mainstream politics a really profound shift. And I think that the student protests have contributed to that. The other thing is that the people who have been most targeted in the more politicized side of the immigration crackdown, people like Mahmoud Khalil, and others who've been targeted for deportation based on their involvement in the protests, those people have had a lot of support even from those who disagree with their views on Israel and Palestine, because they just feel it's wildly anti-democratic to take immigration action against people like that. So the permission structure is different. Younger people talk to their parents, and I'm not just, I'm including in, families that I know where you have parents who are deeply invested in their relationship to Israel and their support of Israel over the years. And then kids who are in their 20s who might have voted for Mamdani, who might feel really, really disturbed by and outraged by the war in Gaza, who are pushing their parents. The conversation around the dinner table is different. Like, this is where this stuff is lived. So I think the protests actually, while they have provided an excuse for the Trump administration's crackdown on universities, and while they are providing an excuse for a really McCarthyite set of both immigration crackdowns, if you like, cancellations, and a huge backlash, they have also, the conversation has 1,000% moved. And the protests were, really important in that, whatever one's views on them are. Movements matter. And there's a sort of default, fearful position in the Democratic Party that we are now going to be associated with this terrifying radicalism, and we need to repudiate it. And that fight is going to carry on. But I think you can. Part of the reason this election in New York is both freaking people out and exciting people is that it shows you that there is as much potential energy in that gap as there is to worry about if you think you need to tack more mainstream to fight Trump.
Thanks, Aarav, for your question. And now I want to move into this segment about South Africa, Nic. And I want to start with the two images I think that a lot of people would have been witness to and would have stayed in their minds, the most recent images. One, the president of South Africa, and his interaction with the orange man. It was quite, I'm sure anybody who cares even a little for things such as, anti-racist struggles or equality would have found it difficult to see a black man, humiliated like that by this orange madman. And then you have a few days later, this fantastic image of the South African cricket team, the championships, and how, Themba Bavuma, this whole joyous image that came from there. And they said that victory itself was a transformative movement in South Africa. And the fact that the first captain who managed to achieve this was a black man had all of these messages going out, perhaps even messages of reconciliation to a certain extent. Reconciliation is a term that's used often in the context of South Africa. But given that there have been these frayed nerves with Elon Musk and what have you, Trump and all of these people saying things about a white genocide, then you see Themba Bavuma and all of this joy around the cricket team. I just want your initial reflections on these two images, and then we'll get deeper into what's happening in South Africa.
Yeah, Themba Bavuma and the South African cricket team, or Siya Kolisi and the South African rugby team, also world champions. Both leaders of teams where a lot of people said that the South African excellence in these sports was going to be destroyed by reservation. And then you have them go on to this extraordinary world-beating performance, and with the whole of South Africa unites behind them. It's like a cheesy image in some respects, but actually incredibly powerful, because the real lived feeling of South Africans was so intense, and it connects directly to some of the most contentious politics about the way that reservation, for example, worked in South Africa. So it's also true that Musk's and Trump's attacks on South Africa and their assertion of this myth of white genocide actually, is representative only of a tiny fraction of white South Africans, and the whole ridiculous spectacle of people getting refugee status in the US actually united South Africans very much, but behind the idea that this is in many ways a country with real problems, but in many ways a great place to live and a place that people love and feel a deep affection for. And so maybe it's hard to explain this joke in a podcast, but there's a South African word which essentially means F off, futsek. And so if you want someone to get out of here, like you say, futsek. And the original period after the British abolished slavery and the original white Dutch settlers left the Cape Colony and moved north to get away from that. It was called the Great Trek, because they trekked, away into the heartland. So when these so-called refugees were leaving, the joke that was going around in South Africa was that it was the Great Futsek, the Great Sek, go. So really, most South Africans were united in repudiating that ridiculous and false narrative, but also really worried about the impacts on the South African economy that hostility from the US would create. So Ramaphosa was trying to do this delicate thing where he maintained a relationship with the US because it's economically vital for South Africa, while asserting, the truth And the way that he tried to do it was he brought this very South African kind of Bavuma-ish team with him to the White House. So he had these white golfers who, Trump knows and respects to come and say things on his behalf. He had Johan Rupert, who is, on the far left of South Africa, kind of reviled, but he's the chairman of a huge global luxury goods conglomerate, LVMH, and he came along to put his word in, and Ramaphosa, a trade union leader, came as well. So Ramaphosa did this Team South Africa United in Our Diversity, and he didn't give all the answers himself. He tried to let them answer. Now, whether it worked, we can debate, but he was trying to show a different kind of leadership and a different kind of country. In the politics of TV spectacle, maybe, it was obviously awkward and it was awful, but it came from a very earnestly felt South African idea of the big tent of who we are.
This big tent of who South Africans are, the ANC has tried to be that big tent for the longest time. And I hope that we'll be able to get our hands deep into that conversation, because the ANC is you said it yourself you sent me this mail in which you said that there is so much in common between shared history as well as in terms of ideology, so much in common between the ANC and the INC, the Indian National Congress, right? This attempt at big tent politics and how things come apart at the pegs. Now, where do I start this conversation? Can we start with the internal contradiction, I suppose, which is, I don't know if you'll agree, if it is best represented by this character Julius Malema, who's supposed to be. You tell me what he's supposed to be, and or should I give you my first impressions and then you react to it?
I'll react to you. That will be more interesting.
Okay. So, this is a weird comparison. Okay. So, Chandrasekhar Azad, in a sense, is a chip off of the BSP bloc. And the BSP, in a sense, is this real post-apartheid party in India, to my mind, because the Congress is really not. Congress might be the post-colonial party, but the post-apartheid party, to my mind, is the BSP. So to that extent, it is not unfair, or it's not outlandish to compare the BSP with the ANC. Hear me, okay? Hear me. Okay. Now, my point here, the only simple small point here is that Chandrasekhar Azad is a chip off of that block, and he says some of the most powerful things, in a way, distilled out of that ideology, which is the question of representation, which is the question of power, which is the question of redistribution of resources, which is a question of, let's say, reservations in private sector. Why that? The fact that the BSP was a party which believed in grassroots mobilization and agitation, and that's a path that it has kind of eschewed. It's a little circumspect about these things now, protests and demonstrations and agitations and all of that. So there emerges this one character who fills that vacuum and says, "I am the prodigal son." Okay, now to that metaphor, I see a Malema kind of fitting, because he's originally ANC. He's part of what you would call the original ideological ANC. And then he finds too many contradictions within the ANC. So he emerges and finally breaks away and announces himself as a Marxist-Leninist. Wears his red cap and... Okay, so how off mark did I go with all of that?
I mean, I think the problem... There is something to that, right? But I think the problem with it is that the ANC BSP analogy is a bit strained. I think maybe the problem in South Africa is that we haven't had a BSP. We still have the single dominant party of the ANC, which is now, it never split, but little flakes have come off it, and it's got smaller and smaller. And Malema and his economic freedom fighters is one of those flakes breaking off. But in many ways, it's essentially a faction of the ANC that's still, functioning within some of those bounds. And its ideological program is clear, but it also has a kind of Malema has had some pretty kleptocratic tendencies himself. He's been interested in, his own wealth accumulation. He's been they've been party to pretty profound corruption, for example, in a major bank, which ended up wiping out the savings of many of the very people whom the economic freedom fighters aim to represent. So that kind of mix of a...
Can I just throw in a quick caveat there? So I was watching one of his interviews and he was asked obviously about this, and he said that was his younger self, and now he's reformed as this responsible person who's married and has children and has the best of his country and his family at heart and all of that. Nevertheless, anyway, please continue.
Yeah, I mean, that's I'm sure that everyone gets older, even Julius Malema. And by the way, there's obviously value in having some principled left flank pressure on South African politics and on the ANC, like whatever form that takes. But I would love to think through with you where kind of caste politics in that UP sense and South Africa's politics of racial redistribution line up and don't line up. I mean, there is certainly, there's some crude analogies you can make between UP under Mayawati and, South Africa under the ANC and kind of, but the ANC was a much bigger tent than even the BST probably, ranging from, a more out and out black capitalist or social democrat, multiracial but capitalist alignment, through to a more Malema alignment, and then with a whole bunch of people who are mainly interested in what we can use this language of primitive accumulation of like ways in which the state can enrich people. And Malema certainly was, his split with the ANC was originally about factional battles over resources and power within the party. And I think the ideology, a lot of it was adopted as a rationale for these battles over resources. Whether now it can find its place as a political program that's responsive to South Africa's extreme inequality and be that. Maybe another piece of context to add is that as the ANC's power has diminished and as it has spun off and fractured into these new parties, one direction that they go is in the direction of, what in South Africa we would think of as a xenophobia of nationalism and of the rejection of immigration and of the scapegoating and targeting of African immigrants who are in South Africa. Malema and his party have largely eschewed that temptation. And it's a very strong temptation. It's a temptation that infects the ANC, but some of the other smaller parties have really taken a appallingly xenophobic nationalist line. So,
Malema, I lost you there. You're saying that no. Okay.
No. He has not really gone down that route. I think if he was, just completely unprincipled, that is where he would go. And that's where some of the other politicians that have emerged from the breakdown of the ANC have gone, and where they've accumulated a lot of their support. And he hasn't done that. The split in the ANC that's kind of, between those who want to maintain constitutional values, essentially, and democratic values, and those who are mostly interested in accumulation and will adopt whatever ideological color suits them to do that. I mean, that's not Jacob Zuma's party, Umkhonto, which is named after the old armed wing of the ANC. And he uses similar ideological language to Malema. In his case, it's very clearly about his power, his economic interests, staying out of jail, maybe a bit of ethnic nationalism as well. Malema is a much more complicated figure than that. I think.
Nick, actually, I forgot to set context for Malema. So for those of you who are wondering, I mean, I'm sure some of you who follow the South African, political scene might know him, but Malema is the person who Trump was, fuming about. So when this meeting happened between Ramaphosa and Trump, he showed one of the videos of what's his name? Of Malema, in which there's a song, Kill the Boer, right? The Kill the Boer is
Dubuli Budo,
yeah. That, so that was the reference, I suppose, which will help you locate this person. So he's seen as somebody who is calling for a white genocide because of this song. So Nick, can you tell us about this song a little bit and also the context of this? Because see, our man is also talking about a Marxist-Leninist revolution. He is very, very impressed by the Bolshevik revolution. He throws in references from the Long March. He's constantly talking about Russian and Chinese examples. So, when asked pointedly, if there's going to be an armed resolution to this question of redistribution of wealth, he says if it comes to it, then, we'll see. But he's saying that if it shouldn't come to it and all of that. But nevertheless, he's somebody who can set people off a little bit. So anyway, you were saying, yeah.
I mean, Malema is a populist. He's like a mirror of Trump in some respects. Identifies rightly the fact that the vast majority of privately owned land in South Africa is still in white hands, and that wealth is still enormously skewed in its distribution toward white South Africans. And so he sings an old revolutionary song, which is kill the Boer, kill the farmer, kill the Boer. It doesn't literally mean the farmer. It means the people who were the originators of apartheid and its primary beneficiaries. So the Boer was the Afrikaner. People used to call the police the Boers, or the soldiers. The Boers are coming. And the Boer meaning the Afrikaner, and the representative of apartheid. So when he sings that, he will say, well, we're reviving this revolutionary song. It's kind of a metaphor. There was a previous song that said, or slogan, one settler, one bullet, which was similarly controversial, and people would chant settler, settler, bullet, bullet, which obviously, freaked out the settlers considerably. And it continued to be sung and chanted after apartheid, and a lot of kind of South African liberals felt that it shouldn't be sung anymore. We had moved past that. So Malema is trying to reconnect that struggle tradition with a confrontation of the ANC and of South African business and others with the fact that land reform and economic redistribution, certainly land reform, has failed completely. And then he knows, of course, that in a context where you have the global right wing retailing this idea of white genocide, and that in a South African context where a lot of people are kind of comfortably trying to say, well, we've moved on from the past, we've all forgiven each other, let's forget about it and we'll keep our farms and you'll, gradually make your way up the ladder, that you confront them with this upsetting slogan, or you confront them with Marxist-Leninist rhetoric, and you spur a response. So, he knows what he's doing, and that's the effect it has. The law that Trump and Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk and all of these people are attacking is a law which allows, under certain limited circumstances, the state to seize land without compensation, kind of an eminent domain type of provision. Why that's important is that over the last 30 years in South Africa, the land reform process has relied on a principle called willing buyer, willing seller. So that means if the government wants to return a farm to a white-owned farm to maybe its previous black owners from before apartheid, or simply to redistribute it and ensure that black farmers have access to that land, that they will negotiate with you and pay you some kind of market value for the land. This new law enables them to do that more kind of preemptively and without an agreement. It is subject to judicial review. It can only be used in limited circumstances. It does not actually represent a Malema position on land reform. It's a minimum threshold that he would want, but it's not his position. And so what Ramaphosa is defending and what Malema is calling for are not the same thing. But of course, Trump conflates them. And Ramaphosa in that meeting in the White House is trying to prize them apart and make a distinction again.
In fact, I was reading up on this amendment. In fact, it's actually not a new law. It's an amendment to an old law.
Correct.
A colonial era law. I think it's called the 1975 expropriation law. And the only amendment. And so you have in the case of land, you have for a public purpose and in public interest are two completely different things. And for the Indian audiences, for public purposes is when the government acquires for an industrial park, for roads, for any school, hospital, for a public purpose. In public interest is something different, which is where we come into the question of redistribution of land, about land reforms. So this amendment to the South African law has been made to make it easier to acquire lands for public purposes, which means for roads and projects and what have you. But it is not a direction, not a step in the direction of land reforms, is what I hear. So therefore,
Yeah, I mean, its critics see it as the thin end of the wedge, right? And they see it as a dilution of the private property clause of the Constitution, which was one of the more contested things when the Constitution was being negotiated. Many people feel, and people who think of themselves as Marxist-Leninists would say that that was a compromise that Mandela and Ramaphosa made that they shouldn't have. It grounded South Africa's Constitution too much in an idea of private property and capitalism. So for those who are fearful about the thin end of the wedge, they think that this law is the thin end of the wedge. There's no evidence that it is.
Right. But that said, there was this compromise. Would you agree, Nick? I don't know. This is a question because I've heard about this compromise. Now, when is this new constitution getting drafted? It is getting drafted in a world that is now firmly within Western grasp. The Soviet Union has collapsed in 1989. 1991, Mandela is released. I think 2 years later, the constitution is adopted. So we are suddenly looking at a very liberal Western democratic framework for a post-apartheid South Africa, in which a lot of the vision for that country going forward is shaped by the US, the UK, Canada, and so I want you to respond to that first. Is that true? And is that something where South Africa perhaps faltered because the influence of the left was also in a sense discredited because of what happened in Stalinist Russia, all of that. So it became less sexy to be a leftist in the early 90s, well, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's definitely true. I think the South African Constitution is actually a more capacious and dynamic document, though, than that might suggest. Because, yes, it's a liberal democratic constitution. It asserts that the ground of governance is constitutional law. There's not parliamentary sovereignty. There is certainly not a single party like a revolutionary vanguard party that gets to determine what happens. The constitution forms the ground of South African democracy, but it is not a value neutral idea of what that democracy should look like. So the preamble, speaks very directly to South Africa's history. The history of discrimination, of bloodshed, of struggle, saluting those who helped to bring liberation. That is all in the preamble. And the Bill of Rights incorporates social and economic rights very deeply into the fabric of the South African system. Now, from the left, you could say, well, okay, that is taking the project of real kind of class struggle or real redress and reducing it to this series of kind of goals that can progressively be realized, and in fact, it just waters down the impetus, and that justiciable rights are not enough. to deliver true freedom. But they certainly go a great deal further than most Western constitutions do, both in the recognition of historic injustice and in the idea of a constitutional democracy as a tool for overturning those things. So I think it's tempting I think there's a very good, interesting debate about where the balance ends up falling and what happens in practice in the years afterwards, and how much to blame or praise the Constitution and how much to blame or praise the dominant party, the ANC. But it's not just a Canadian Constitution or a German Constitution. It's a Constitution that is very deeply informed by South Africa's history of discrimination, and that bakes in legal mechanisms and tries to use constitutional democracy as an instrument of liberation. And that's where I argue that there is more Ambedkar in the South African Constitution than there is Gandhi, and maybe more Ambedkar in Mandela than there is Gandhi. And maybe that is an optimistic view of it from my perspective, but there is a view of the Constitution that it can be a more like emancipatory instrument than some other Western constitutions are. Of course, practically and politically, in the economic choices, the period of austerity that we had in the 1990s, there were lots of things that were reflected, attack towards the Washington Consensus. But South Africa didn't privatize all of its state-owned enterprises. And South Africa's system of Black economic empowerment, which includes job reservation, state procurement, mining licensing, is an enormous, enormous state intervention in the economy that is not like Western liberal in the least.
Right. So you've seen both the Indian and the South African experiments with reconstruction, with looking at creating a society that does not have the barriers that existed in the past. Now, removing those barriers means policies, and the policies that have been tried in India include, starting most importantly with affirmative action, which is reservation of jobs, education, and elected offices. So there is that, and the one area in which India has failed largely is redistribution of wealth and resources. And also, of course, this affirmative action policy applies only to the government sector, not the private sector, which is 90+% of the economy. Now, I understand that in South Africa, this affirmative action policy extends not just to the private sector, but also to the cricket team and the rugby team and, all facets of life. So there is no, like in India, there are many exemptions to affirmative action. There are no such exemptions, I understand, in South Africa. But the one project which did not happen, and I've heard this neoliberal capitalist Washington Consensus blame for this. The one thing that hasn't happened, which is what gives the left a talking point, is land reforms. And land reforms haven't happened in India either. But to whatever extent they've happened, it's just been Kerala, Bengal, and Kashmir is where we've seen some amount of land reforms. So this question of land reforms is what didn't get addressed in South Africa. And that was really the compromise with neoliberalism, is what I've heard. Is that true?
I'm not sure that it is actually, because there significant processes were set up for land reform, a legal framework. There's a land court. Resources were set aside. Money was set aside. There's a government department that's responsible for executing it. It has been completely botched. And, whether those instruments and the design of those instruments was adequate or not, I'm not sure, but the execution and the political will has been a complete failure. So you have really weak systems for supporting new Black farmers. So sometimes when land is transferred, you have projects that fail. You have a lack of capital. You have a very highly capital intensive and very sophisticated commercial farming sector that is incredibly economically important, that is white dominated, that employs a lot of people, and actually building a land reform process that acknowledges that reality, that mobilizes significant capital behind changing the racial complexion of the agriculture sector has been a massive failure of implementation. but they did create legal mechanisms, judicial mechanisms, a bank, all kinds of things to do it. And, together with the failure to provide a quality primary and secondary education to Black South Africans, the failure of land reform is a massive political and implementation failure by the ANC. As much as it is, I don't think it's because they didn't give themselves legal elbow room due to concerns of looking more pro-Western.
Right. So
it was a lot of hatred.
So you're saying that there is still provision within the South African legal framework for land reforms, despite which it hasn't happened. It's not an absence of clauses in the law.
No, there are all kinds of empowering clauses in the law and instruments. And there's, in fact, when some of these things have been tested in court, they have almost invariably come down on the side of reform and redistribution, because there's reform and there's redistribution. And we have a mix of restitution, because we have people still living in South Africa whose land was taken from them, who were personally dispossessed. And there's a process for returning, for making land claims and returning land to people. And then a separate process for attempting to reform the overall complexion of ownership. And restitution has gone a little bit better than redistribution, but they've both been really plagued by shockingly poor implementation.
When you say restitution, it is restitution of individual rights or community rights? Because I don't understand.
Oh, that's a very good question. And it can be both, because it depends on the nature of the prior land ownership. So you might have, as Sudipto Mondal, you might have had your farm, right? And in 1963, the apartheid government might have said, well, this is now a white area and we are taking your land. And you're going to be moving over there to the new Bantustan. And then you, as Sudipto and maybe your relatives, could go and sue to get that land back. And then the state would assist in that process with the capital, with the legal support, etc. And so you would make a land claim. In some cases of rural land, you might have had a community that lived on that land and didn't have the same kind of title that you as Sudipto would have had. Then you too can make a claim as a community, and there have been many such. Then in urban settings, of course, you have whole neighborhoods that were stolen by the apartheid government from their inhabitants. A very famous example is District 6 in Cape Town, where I come from, where individual families would have had title to their homes. They were forced out. Their homes were bulldozed. District 6 is still an empty scar, in some of the most valuable land in Cape Town. But pockets of this all across the city. And there are processes that roll individual claims up into a process that relates to the whole area. And those get very, very messy, because you have, some people want to take cash compensation. Some people want the land back. There are all kinds of contestations, as you would say, about how that shakes out. But basically, all of these cases are considered both in the law and in the economics of land claims.
Nic, while we're talking about land, one thing that comes up every time South Africa is discussed, in whether positively, negatively, whether for land reforms or anti-land reforms, everyone gives the example of Zimbabwe. Can you give us a sense of what exactly happened and why this contrast is always a point of reference?
Yeah, I mean, in Zimbabwe, during the first period, or first post-liberation period, the large white-owned commercial farms in Zimbabwe operated much as they had, before Zimbabwe became a democracy. And after, perhaps 10 years of democracy, Robert Mugabe, the Zimbabwean leader, decided to radically change the land redistribution process and to seize white-owned farms without compensation. That was done it was done in essentially an extra-legal way. People were summarily forced off their land. In some cases, it was genuinely given to local communities who were able to farm it. In other cases, it was given to cabinet ministers and their friends and family. It was a very disruptive, sometimes violent process, and the evidence from it is very mixed. In some cases, this is not often allowed in the discourse about Zimbabwean land reform. In some cases, it resulted in new owners taking over, reaping economic benefits, running those farms effectively. In other cases, it resulted in the capture of commercially productive farms by politically connected people who were able to extract resources from them. And in other cases, it led to breakdown and decay in productive capacity. So it's a very complex story, but it was carried out in a very, an essentially extra-legal or kind of quasi-revolutionary way. The South African process has many, many, many safeguards. And, if you are Julius Malema, I think you feel that those safeguards are too many, and they are the reason that the process has been too slow and that it's failed, because there's all kinds of layers of judicial review. There are all kinds of regulations and government processes for setting these things in motion. South Africa is really committed to the rule of law and is going to have, even if it decides to go for a much more aggressive program, it's still likely to be legally governed. The other thing I would say in the South African context is that South Africa has urbanized significantly, and it's very much open to question whether the best tool for economic redress in South Africa is giving people a piece of land. As I said, South Africa's agriculture sector is very different from India's. It's much more capital intensive. Of course, there is capital intensity in Indian farming, but it's capital intensive, large scale farming by and large. So it requires expensive irrigation, expensive tractors, high input costs. And it speaks principally to, speaks heavily to export markets, and of course to urban consumers. So in some ways, the debate around land is a little bit of it's very understandable that people's ownership of the land and people's sense of, connection to land that was literally stolen from them is very meaningful. And liberals tend to be a bit too dismissive of that when they say land isn't where the action is. But it's also true that where the action is can I get a job in a city where I can get my kids educated, where I can move up the ladder, where I can, in a sense, that's where the real action is.
Right. And also, that's also where this insecurity perhaps stems from, right? The white insecurity. I picked up on an Afrikaans term. It's called Swartgevaar, which means Swartgevaar, which means black danger, and this ideology, which is like most other ideologies which are, xenophobic, or let's say, fear mongering about an uprising, but, I can to some extent not see where the fears are coming from. But then what I do see from Africa emerging is this discourse about how we, like in India, we talk about Jal Jangal Jameen, right? In Dandakaranya, in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, there's the talk about Jal Jangal Jameen. You're extracting bauxite and ore from our mountains, and we need a share in that. So you have an Ibrahim Traore emerging. That suddenly Sankara is somebody who's on people's lips all over again, and Malema is seen as a Black Panther, Frantz Fanon, and Che Guevara kind of character rolled into one, who also has some Biko kind of notes in him. So this politics that is emerging in the, what would you call it, what, Pan-Africanist kind of a politics, which is now strongly informed by some left Marxist-Leninist kind of thinking. Where do you see it heading? I see it creating a lot of insecurities among the white landholding population, but what do you see emerging from this?
I don't think the white landholding population is actually all that important in these politics. They're more important now maybe than they were 5 years ago, because the coalition government with Ramaphosa includes essentially a white landholding component, and the Minister of Agriculture is white, a white liberal, not from the Democratic Alliance, not an ANC leftist. So they're more important than they used to be, and they've maintained a lot of power and resources. So maybe I'm exaggerating, but in where this politics goes, and in the kind of race politics of South Africa, I don't think they are anymore the most important. In fact, they certainly are a minority, even of like white opinion. And I don't, the Swart Gafar, the Black Danger was a mobilizing force during apartheid and the immediate post-apartheid period. Like, the black people are coming for your wealth, the black man is coming for your daughter, and there was a Rooi Gafar, the communist danger, as well. I think the kind of animating currents are a little different now. There was a Pan-Africanist counterpart to the ANC called the Pan-Africanist Congress, and during the struggle years, it was considered to be, not as powerful as the ANC, but almost as important, and it withered and collapsed immediately post-democracy. Some of it was imbibed and ingested into the ANC. It tried to stand alone as a party of more aggressive land redistribution. But especially under Mbeki, when Mbeki really had a black nationalist and Pan-Africanist articulation of the ANC's position, it became kind of completely irrelevant. And I think that the complicated thing for Malema maybe is that he mobilizes the land discourse, but on behalf of an essentially urban proletariat and the urban unemployed. But not really, I don't think that many EFF voters are necessarily the unemployed. They're like students and, people like that. So are those people really motivated by a desire to get land back, or are they motivated by the symbolic currency of restitution and of there is a thing that has been taken from us. There is wealth somewhere that has been taken from us. Can we take it back? And the reliance on a kind of Russian or Chinese iconographic set of resources, I'm not sure that it speaks in any fundamental way to what that population, what those voters, what those people are motivated by. People want jobs. They want an amelioration of inequality. They want to feel like they're empowered in their own country. So it feels like a slightly incoherent project to me, with lots of strong motivating factors.
Yeah, actually, when you put it like that, it will take me to the last question actually that I really have, and that's the big question of ideologies. So in a sense of metaphor, you have what the Marx generation or the Moses generation, right? Which is that in the case of Moses, he takes them to the promised land. And in the case of the ANC and Mandela, there is a certain promise that they delivered on, this promise of a constitutionally governed South Africa, a post-apartheid South Africa. So that was, to my mind, the Moses generation. And there is some kind of a cry out in Africa, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of that continent as well, for a Jesus generation, or for that matter, like a Lenin generation. Right? The person who puts the theory into practice. So what is the new covenant is what I was trying to get at. So what is the new covenant? Because there is of course Marx, but then Lenin interprets it for the Russian context. So that's why I'm asking you. So what is the new covenant you see emerging from all of this?
I don't know that there is a really theorized ideological and then also political and organized answer to that question right now. There's a huge degree of incoherence.
Can I help you there a little bit? Do you think the conditions will create the politics, or the politics will create the conditions? You know?
I think the politics are going to emerge out of the conditions. Unfortunately, right now, that is, in Gramscian terms, pretty morbid symptoms that are arising in this interregnum, and those morbid symptoms are xenophobia and primitive accumulation, corruption, and there is a the politics of aspiration and of bling. And of primitive accumulation are and of consumption are very much mixed up with the politics of liberation in ways that won't be totally unfamiliar to you. And what a more positive program looks like, it's hard to see. And so as a result, you fall back on kind of more technocratic, social democratic types of answers, like, well, some sort of constitutional coalition of liberals and social democrats has to get its act together to ensure that the education system works and ensure that you get, climate transition and ensure that the welfare system is genuinely ameliorative. And like, that's your best hope, while all these fractions of other stuff happen around the margins. What I'm fearful about is that that the more positive program doesn't emerge, and that you get stuck in this kind of interregnum place, and you are offered only a kind of Malema populist utopianism on the one hand, or a kind of dying technocracy on the other hand, or a totally corrupt system. And I think, unfortunately, the cricket team and the rugby team don't really give you an answer to that. But at the moment, in the symbolic politics of South Africa, people reach for that and say, well, actually, this kind of affirmative action sort of worked, but we all got together and the greatest talents emerged, and we thrived, and that's what we should do at a national level. But, that's pretty incoherent as a political program.
Right. The symbolic over the substantive. Nic, before I let you go, I mean, we've been at it for an hour and a half now. There's a last question. You are one of the people who I really look up to in journalism. So I want you to kind of give us a sense of where you see the profession headed now that you are in this independent media space as well. And the conditions in the US are not too different from out here in India. Trump is really going for you guys. Where do you see independent media headed? I know it's a digression from all that we've discussed so far, but I want to get a closing comment from you. Where do you see journalism headed?
I think everything that we've discussed so far is actually intimately connected with where journalism is headed, because the disordered information environment that we operate in is an outgrowth of a lot of the forces, or the bigger forces behind what we've been discussing for the whole hour and a half. And so our confident predictions in journalism are probably mostly wrong and should be dismissed. And that's why we both live in such a precarious space, and we should have all done what our parents would have preferred and become engineers or lawyers. But here we are. I think that, the pressures that have come upon our sector from the combination of tech platform power and right-wing populism are intensifying, and in many ways are going to get worse. And the AI revolution is taking, we have already been impoverished by the advertising duopoly of Google and Meta, and that is only going to be accelerated by AI. They will tell you that, actually it's going to be wonderful for us because we can become incredibly efficient and have all of our work done by LLMs, and we can keep them under our control and do great things. But I think the risks to both our economic sustainability and our ability to create trusted relationships with people are profound. Where the hope lies is in what you're trying to do and what we're trying to do here at the city, which is to build news organizations that are in dialogue with their communities and their audiences, that hear back from them, that are responsive to their concerns, and that don't think of themselves as institutions that exercise power so much as there are nodes of information infrastructure that enable people to realize their power. And so I think it's in this kind of work, as fragile as it is, as contingent as it is, as much as we struggle to keep the lights on, that the real hope lies. Because if you are producing commodity news on a national scale with no connection to a particular community, you know, AI is coming for your lunch big time. If you sit here in New York City and you can go and have a community meeting in a library branch in Queens and talk to people about what's troubling them, and then use your investigative skills to find stuff out and put it into the world and reach people directly, send them an email, send them a postcard as we do to their apartment, have them come and join you in an event, discover new original facts, your chance of being relevant and thriving is much greater. So I don't want to be like just a Pollyanna or talk my book. I think there are huge both press freedom dangers and technology and commercial threats that we face. But I think we're also discovering a model that says, like, the good old days were not necessarily all that good. And the real potentiality lies in these new strange creatures that we're trying to build, people like us. I think we can be much more open and contingent and humble than some of the political figures that we're talking about as we try to make ourselves relevant to people and earn their trust.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. That's a lot, Nic. Thanks a lot. Lot to think about over there. That was my mentor, my former boss, Nic Dawes. To pick on one of the things he was talking about, us being in conversation with society. You know, Nic used to always say that journalism at its best is society in conversation with itself. I'm paraphrasing here, but you get the picture. I hope you find this meaningful. I hope there's something you were left with to ponder about. This is an educational experiment. We're trying to do some political education over here. I hope you were left enlightened by this conversation. Please subscribe to the News Minute, to News Laundry, and to The City. Thanks, Nic, once again for joining us for this conversation.
Thanks, Sudipto. It was really good to be able to delve into some of these themes that we've been talking about for more than 10 years in a very new context.